And the third programme, no competition in sight. But things have changed since then.
LBC News Talk 97.3.
95.8 Capital FM. London 100 Kiss FM.
There are now 112 local commercial radio services around the country, and these are soon to be joined by 3 new national commercial radio stations. So how has the BBC reacted to this competition?
In the beginning, the Word already was. The Word was in God's presence, and what God was, the Word was.
The Word has been the mainstay of Radio 4 for over 40 years, and during that period nothing much has really changed. But then controller Michael Green thought it was time for some radical rescheduling. Morning Story was moved to the mid-afternoon. Forward came the afternoon play from 3 to 2 p.m. At 10, the station splits into 2 frequencies, with entertainment on FM and the Bible on longwave. And, following the Bible, in the biggest shake-up of all, comes another sacred object.
And now it's time for Woman's Hour with Jenny Murray.
Good morning. Price wars and trading on a Sunday. Cutthroat competition at the supermarket.
Plans to move Women's Hour provoked one of the biggest rows of the year, prompting thousands of complaints and strong opposition from the programme's production team. The BBC replied that changes were necessary to boost Radio 4's audience and were only made after extensive research. Has it worked? Well, there's no doubt that the change has been good for ratings, attracting up to 250,000 more listeners to Women's Hour.
It was a bit of a shock to think, my goodness, this programme I've lived with all my life is actually going to move to the morning. We are encouraged, though, by the fact that we've put on 250,000 new listeners in the morning. That's a bigger audience listening to what I consider to be a very important programme. There's also an evening repeat starting the beginning of this year. So we hope that those people who can't listen to us in the morning will be able to get us in the early evening.
It's not just Radio 4 which has been moved around. From tomorrow, Radio 2 listeners will wake up to a new schedule, and one of the men who's been moved is at work behind this door. Let's find out how he feels about the changes.
Morning, morning, Jameson here, back in the bunker after a week on the telly. My goodness, radio's best, you know.
Derek Jameson, Radio 2's morning presenter for 6 years, will be hosting a new late-night show with his wife Ella.
You've got to think of the Beeb as like the old music hall. You are employed to do a turn, and they employed me to do the morning shift for all those years, and now someone up there on high has decided, let's change the acts, let's turn the bill round, and they've got me doing the late night one, the 10:30 at night, and it's my job as an artiste. I'm an artiste, I have to make it work.
Schedule changes are one way of responding to the competition, but are they enough? Nationally, the BBC's audience share has fallen over the last 3 years from 65% to 59%. Over the same period, commercial radio share has increased from 31% to 36%. But it's in London that the threat is most clear-cut. Last year, for the first time, more Londoners listened to commercial radio than to all the BBC stations put together. In the light of all of this, some critics of the BBC say it's time for a rethink, time to redefine the whole meaning of the BBC's public service remit. I'm on my way to meet a man well placed to comment on the fast-changing radio scene. He's been the presenter of Radio 4's feedback programme for the past 6 years, Chris Dunkley.
They've obviously got the difficulty that where they do face competition over popular music, they have tended to be losing. If you look at the London situation, which is the most dramatic, I suppose, they have lost quite heavily over recent years to popular, middle-of-the-road music stations. So they've got to decide what they're going to do with Radio 1 and Radio 2. In speech radio, on Radio 4, they've got to decide whether or not they want to run a rolling news service. There's been a lot of talk about it over the last few years with things like the Gulf War or Tiananmen Square. And they have to decide whether to put lots of resources into that and run a permanent news service. They have to decide whether they've got Radio 5 right. A lot of people would say they've got it wrong because it's had such low figures, and a lot of people are not clear about what it's trying to do. Radio 3 has always had a tiny audience. Can they sustain a station which costs so much per capita when they're being pushed into a more and more competitive situation? They face a huge dilemma across the entire front.
A huge dilemma. Do you know the answer to any of those questions?
I think what we've got to do is decide on the programme areas that we need to cover in the future. There's no doubt the BBC has always had a network monopoly in this country, and that's going to be changed very dramatically. And we've got to see what the competition's going to be like. We know that Classic FM is going to be the first network, and that comes on stream this year. We don't know what the second and third networks are going to be. But even at local level, there are now 105 commercial stations with split wavelengths in some cases competing against the BBC. So this is new territory for the BBC to be challenged in this way in radio.
Well, let's talk about local radio in a minute, but first of all I'd like to talk about radios 1 and 2. Mike Phillips?
I wonder if Sir Michael could tell us what the future holds for Radio 1 and 2, given the BBC's finite resources and the fact that the network of independent local radio stations throughout the UK provides a sort of programming that's virtually indistinguishable from that offered by Radios 1 and 2. Why does the BBC feel it needs to compete with the independent radio network?
Well, I hope you don't find it indistinguishable, because if you actually take Radio 1, we don't just play records, we encourage new bands. We allow young groups who haven't got any recording contracts to come into our studios. I think we have about 5,000 studio hours a year devoted to new groups who have this opportunity to broadcast. That must be good for popular music making in this country. The most listened to radio bulletin on the BBC is not on Radio 4, it's on Radio 1 at 12:30 every lunchtime. Radio 1 includes community programmes where we talk to younger people about problems of drug abuse, alcohol, about job opportunities, career guidance, where we get millions of pamphlets which we get involved with and thousands of phone calls that we deal with youngsters. That isn't mirrored anywhere
are you persuaded
in the kind of
by
Radio
that?
1.
It may not be mirrored to the same degree at the moment, certainly not on a national basis, but before long we will have at least 3 independent national radio stations, one of which is more than likely to play popular music and will very likely take on the sort of public service aspects that you've mentioned. And they are a very limited amount of Radio 1's output. They're very good and should be commended, but they do nevertheless form a very small proportion of the output of Radio 1, which is basically wall-to-wall music. And the point you mentioned about the new bands, I believe, is also adequately covered by independent local radio and will surely be done by national radio as well.
I think that I'd be very surprised if commercial stations who have got to be considering their advertising income and their audience levels are going to be prepared to commission and encourage new bands to deal with news, to deal with community issues in the way that the BBC has.
One of the things that you say you're going to do, or possibly going to do, is to start a rolling news service. Now, Janice Foster-Jones, you have a particular interest in this, don't you?
Yes, my husband was one of the Human Shield hostages in Iraq, and whilst he was away I was desperate for up-to-date news. So I was delighted that you introduced the rolling news service during the Gulf War.
Would you like to be permanent?
Yes, I would. I'm rather disappointed that you haven't continued it, because I think it was very popular. There have been a lot of important news stories this year. And we are now in 1992. I feel there's scope for a lot more detailed news from Europe.
Well, Sir Michael, we've got a general election coming along. Can you promise us a rolling news service by then?
No, I don't think we're planning to do that. There are a number of issues involved. We know when there is a major news story like the Gulf, clearly there is a great appetite for it. And indeed, when the Gorbachev coup in August and when Terry Waite's return, we always now split Radio 4 and put a news service, an extended news service, on long wave, because long wave will be the future of such a service. What we're considering is whether we can sustain such a service through normal events. Now, there are a number of views on that. We don't want it to be more speculation and not enough news. That irritates people enormously. I went to a public meeting in Henfield and we asked how many people in the audience, so 350 wanted a rolling news, and 3 people put up their hand. So it's something we have to consider very carefully. There's no doubt that I believe that by the mid-90s we shall have such a service. But it does involve extra money. I think the costs, when I last looked at them, were about £12 million of extra money to run this service for 24 hours a day. We've got to find that money from somewhere. We've got to get the right kind of service. I believe it will be part of the whole fabric of public service provision in radio by the mid-90s. It's not going to come in 1992.
Yes, sir.
What worries me about the development of continuous news is that there's no attempt to use the extra time to give a balanced and coherent news programme. You'll double the length of a news bulletin and the entire rotten bulletin will be devoted to one topic. When, in the first week of the Gulf War, the government found £1 billion to shore up the poll tax. There were the highest unemployment figures for 10 years. Both those stories got 2 sentences each on BBC radio bulletins at a time when you were broadcasting continuous news all day. And it seems to me if there's any serious consideration of even making the extended news bulletins permanent, that there needs to be some discipline, some self-discipline among the broadcasters to say, we're going to try and cover the whole range and not get obsessed with the flavour of today.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, that is the objective. When you're in the Gulf War, I think you'll accept that that was a particular circumstance.
For a few days, yes.
But there's no doubt that we wish to cover in depth all the stories. We want to reflect all the range of opinions as authoritatively as we can. That's why we put more money to get specialist correspondents. That's why we want to go into depth, and the rolling news may well be the answer to that. We've got to get the right framework. There's another fact I didn't mention. I have to be very careful about depriving people of their programmes. The Radio 4 audience is an audience that loves Radio 4, and we have not yet got our transmitters in place to actually get as good a coverage on FM as we've got on long wave. And that is an important consideration, in my mind, and a strategic consideration. We're spending about £5 million a year on FM transmitters. It's no use us producing the programmes if we're not satisfied that people can hear, and we're not causing immense resentment by depriving people of their favourite programme.
Can we broaden this out a bit? Patrick Bowman, I think you've got a question.
Yes, I'd like to turn the question to music. A couple of weeks back, Marmaduke Hussey, the chairman of the BBC, said in a newspaper interview that he saw the BBC as the guardian of the cultural heritage. That's fine. That's exactly what one would expect of public service broadcasting in this country, and what it's always been. He also added a little boast, a proud one at the end, that the BBC was the largest employer in the world of musicians and composers. How does that sit with the recent announcement that the BBC is contemplating axing its 5 orchestras?
Well, we haven't announced that we're contemplating it. We have a series of groups looking at the future of the BBC, in which they're looking at all sorts of themes like the BBC as an entertainer, as an information provider, as an employer, as a cultural provider. The cultural group that have looked at it have produced their report. That hasn't been discussed yet by the Board of Management or the Board of Governors, but a leak of it went into the independent newspaper. We haven't considered that proposition at all. I don't contemplate the axing of orchestras. I see the role of the BBC as a cultural patron as one of its most important and prime characteristics, and one that should be sustained. The only question to be addressed is whether the funding arrangements should be identical for all our orchestras. If you take the Welsh Orchestra, for example, that is jointly funded between the licence payers and the Welsh Arts Council. If you take the orchestra in Northern Ireland, which used to be a BBC orchestra, it is no longer a BBC orchestra. It's called the Ulster Orchestra. It's funded by commercial money, and the BBC pays a contribution for its running. The BBC Symphony Orchestra has a different role. It is concerned with the commissioning of new music and the playing of contemporary music, and I see that as a very important part of its role and something quite unique in musical provision in this country. So the debate about the orchestra is nowhere near over, and we're talking about how we get classical music provision and that commissioning role sustained in the environment we'll be facing later on. So I hope that gives you some reassurance.
Well, there I'm afraid we must bring our radio discussion to an end. One thing we haven't got time for today at all is to go into complaints about specific programmes. But the number of complaints received is one way of measuring the way you feel about BBC output. Without any claims for scientific accuracy, here's the BiteBack hit list for 1991.
At number 10 is the old chestnut of anti-Tory bias, raised back in October by Tory party chairman Chris Patten.
If you don't like the 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock news, phone up. If you don't like Panorama, phone up. If you don't like the Today programme, I can't imagine that would ever happen.
A Sunday Times Maury poll later found that the majority of people think the BBC unbiased, and those who do detect any bias think it is in favour of the Tories. At number 9, there were complaints throughout the year about the raunchy lyrics on Top of the Pops.
But people are still having sex and nothing seems to stop them.
Presumably more of a problem for parents than for the children who buy the records and get them into the charts in the first place. The number of calls about BBC 2's Saturday Night Out An evening of programmes for or about homosexuals in November sent it straight to number 8. But nearly half the calls received were complimentary about this bold piece of programming.
What do lesbians actually do?
In fact, many more people were upset by the departure of presenter Anne Gregg from Holiday 91, enough to take her straight in at number 7. Still there at number 6, the perennial problem of bad language. Singled out for criticism this year was the charity extravaganza Comic Relief.
I never said I could f***ing act, did I?
At number 5, another regular irritant, what many viewers regard as the excessive amount of sport on television.
Oh, come on!
Particularly simultaneous showing of sport on both BBC channels at once. At numbers 4 and 3 is the Gulf War, which drew complaints about saturation coverage and the rescheduling of favourite programmes. Many viewers objected to a perceived pro-Iraqi bias, particularly in the coverage of the Allied bombing of the Baghdad bunker. The second biggest cause for complaint against the BBC is scheduling alterations as a whole. Many people are upset when the BBC promises to broadcast a certain programme at a certain time and then doesn't. But beating everything else and in at number 1 with a bullet, the most complained about programme of the year was the one that was never even shown. A vigorous campaign led by religious groups succeeded in persuading the BBC not to show the controversial film The Last Temptation of Christ.
I suppose it is rather ironic that the most complaints were received about a programme that was never shown. Of course, the BBC was then criticised for giving in to the complainers. That's the way it is. If you've complained to the BBC, have you ever wondered what happens to your phone call or your letter? How much notice does the BBC take of the complaints it receives? And how accountable is it to its viewers and listeners? Well, BiteBack reporter Carol Stone has been to find out.
Yeah. 500,000 of us phone the BBC every year.
Hello, Information Office.
The calls are answered either here in Television Centre or if it's radio in a similar room in Broadcasting House.
Okay. Thank you very much for your call. I'll make sure that's logged.
The calls are typed up into the Information Office log and that gets circulated throughout the BBC for producers and managers to read. But what happens if you write to the BBC? If you send your letter to a particular programme, you'll get a response probably directly from them. But if you write to the chairman or the Director General, the life of a letter can get a little more complicated. Here's the Director General's office. Let's find out what's in his postbag today. Hello, Kathy.
Hello.
Can we see what's in your post this morning?
Right.
Now, is this an average? Is it a lot?
No, this looks pretty normal.
Thames Television? No, Thames Polytechnic. Now that looks, yes, I see. That looks trouble to me. The official letters now leave Broadcasting House to go several miles across London to the new BBC building at White City.
Oxford Circus, Central Line, Lewis, right down to White City.
The mail that the chairman and the Director General are going to reply to get replies drafted here in the Secretariat. The rest go further down the corridor. This is viewer and listener correspondence. They deal with around 2,500 letters a week. That's the bulk of the correspondence addressed to the BBC centrally. That's not all complaints, of course. Most of it is people asking for information. The assistants specialise in different programme areas, so you ought to get a well-informed answer. On the other hand, how many get a standard reply?
Not as many as you might think. I can't actually give you a figure because it's for every one of my staff to make their own assessment of how they're going to reply. If a lot of people write about some quite specific point, and if there is one answer to that, then to produce a standard letter which you send to all the people who are making the identical point doesn't seem to me to be awful. It seems to be entirely sensible, consistent, economical, and a very proper way to respond.
Even so, campaigners with a particular point of view may not be satisfied. Take the case of the Reptile Protection Trust. They'd been upset by Michael Palin going around the world in 80 days, being involved in the disemboweling of a live snake in a Canton restaurant. Their initial complaints, they felt, didn't get them very far, so they made other moves. First, they organised a write-in from a group of celebrities and 23 MPs. The majority received the standard reply. Then the Trust got an early day motion tabled in the House of Commons, and they featured in Points of View, but they still didn't get the programme re-edited before it was repeated last summer. So the Trust went to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, which considers cases of unfair treatment. The Commission felt it didn't fall within their remit, so they referred it to the Broadcasting Standards Council, which deals with matters of taste and decency, and the complaint was partially upheld, though not on the grounds the Trust wanted. After all that, how do they feel now about the BBC's producers and managers?
They are sealed behind the typewriters and numerous other bureaucratic systems, and you really can't get access to them. They need to be exposed in the sense that they can be questioned directly about their involvement in these matters. It's all too easy at the moment for them to simply shirk it off. And when you bear in mind that we had something like 4 people working quite a great deal of time on this particular issue with a great deal of tenacity, it makes you wonder what chance the average person in the street has got making a complaint about something they feel strongly. We put in a lot of effort and we got virtually nowhere.
Although he rarely gets involved in these issues personally, it's the chairman of the BBC who is responsible for the corporation's accountability to the public. What effect do you think these complaints or these comments have on the programmes eventually?
Well, of course, it does depend very much on the validity of the comment. I mean, you very quickly learn, if you see as many letters as I do, when there's a lobby at work. But equally, I think it's a very important part of our public accountability, as indeed this programme is.
You say you have to be careful if there's a lobby at work, but surely with The Last Temptation of Christ there was a lobby at work and you did intervene.
That decision was actually taken by the managing director of television, although I certainly didn't know the amount of letters I'd received. Mind you, I think he'd received a great deal himself. Yes, when I say you have to take into account that, I mean, not all lobbies are causes which necessarily, I think, is in the interest of the BBC to agree with. I mean, they may be, they obviously have a right to give view to their expression of their feelings, but you mustn't automatically be influenced by a lobby. You must be influenced by, really, by whether a complaint is justified or not justified. That's the acid test.
Legally, the Board of Governors, which Marmaduke Hussey chairs, is the BBC. The governors are ultimately responsible for programme standards and represent the public interest.
Matters arising, there are only 2 matters arising. One, World Service Television. John, where is he? Ah, there. John, would you like to bring us up to date?
Yes, Chairman. I think it looks remarkably good. The news bulletins look very solid. We're all aware...
They meet on a regular basis with the Director General, whom they appoint, and the other members of the Board of Management, who run the corporation day to day. There are 12 governors, chosen from the traditional list of the great and the good, to represent the national regions and particular areas of public life, like industry and trade unions. They are appointed by the government of the day, but is that necessarily the best system, or should their selection be more open?
Well, this is obviously a matter for consideration, and we're considering, in the run-up to the new charter, all sorts of varying issues, and that's one of them. I don't think the electoral system is very good. I mean, after all, the BBC is a very, very large and very, very important part of the whole body politic of this country. 94% of people listen or watch the BBC every week. And it's a huge business. And to run a business like that, you have to have people with considerable experience. You just don't want, good though it would be, to have a whole range of people elected. I mean, rather like electing a group of passengers to run British Airways. I mean, it isn't really a very appropriate system.
There's been an internal report by the BBC where there's a feeling that maybe the influence of the governors is too great and that maybe it should be reduced and there should be fewer and there should be trustees to run it. How do you react to that? Do you think you have been too hands-on in the last few years?
No, I don't think so. I think that the way we run the BBC, we've made a great many changes. One of the changes I made was to make certain that at all the governors' meetings, the majority of the Board of Management were present. We never have less than 7 out of 11. It's quite a lot. So all the discussions that take place about major issues are with the governors and the top management together. That's the way you get a consensus view, and a view that can stretch right across the whole organisation as a result. Of course, it is a function in the end for the governors to take the most difficult and the most serious strategic decisions. And that is what we do. But it's one 1 decision a year, 2 decisions a year, not more than that, if as many.
Well, since you've been chairman, you've made some significant decisions as far as the Director General is concerned.
Yeah.
You've sacked one Director General. The present Director General is leaving before he would want to. Do you feel that that's a position that he should be allowed to be put into, a very difficult position for him?
I'm not going to discuss personalities. The first Director General did actually resign. We renewed the present Director General's contract for a further year, so he has a spell of 6 years. We then decided to pass the baton, if you like, on to his deputy, who'd been his deputy. They're both very able men. One has done an extremely good job, I'm sure the next will as well. There has to be some method of appointing whom is the best person to look after the BBC over a period of years.
Well, so Michael, on this question of accountability, I believe that a task force within the BBC has suggested that the Board of Governors has become too involved in everyday management decisions rather than representing the public interest, which is really its job. Now, you've been working with them for 6 years. What do you think?
Yes, it isn't my experience. I'm the closest, I suppose, to the Board of Governors than anybody in the BBC. I think the Chairman was right in saying that we now do involve the Board of Management in the Board of Governors discussions in ways which we didn't 5 years ago. And I think that has enabled the BBC to play to its strengths across radio and television in ways that it didn't. So I don't actually believe that there's been intervention in the day-to-day management. The classic definition, I think, if I could just say that the role of the Chairman, the role of the Director General, was in Michael Swan's, I think, which was that the Chairman should read the map and the Director General should drive the car. I think actually what has happened is that I've driven the car and we've jointly read the map because the strategy has emerged from discussions between Board of Management and Board of Governors.
Yeah, but surely there is a conflict of interest if the Board of Governors is involved in making decisions which it then has to represent the public interest on.
Well, they are there to make sure the public interest is maintained and that I'm sensitive to it. Now, we are all members of a public service broadcasting organisation. We joined it because the BBC was that kind of organisation.
And you're totally happy about the way the Board of Governors works?
Over the last 5 years, I have not found it a difficulty which some of my predecessors have had.
But how did you feel about the fact that your appointment was not extended for a further 5 years? It was widely reported that you wanted and expected it to be.
I certainly didn't expect another 5 years, and I think I'm sometimes misrepresented there. It was a question of what was the most appropriate time for me to go. Somebody had to lead the BBC through the Charter and beyond the Charter, and therefore there had to be a sensible period of transition, and certainly wouldn't have been appropriate for me to have gone on. So I retire in 1996 in any case, before the Charter at the age of 60.
But you're suggesting you would have liked longer?
I would have, oh certainly. I made it quite clear that I thought the most appropriate time for me to go was probably in 1994, after the next financial inquiry had taken place into the BBC, than in 1993.
Of course, you have presided over the BBC for the first time, I think, in its history, over a period of contraction rather than expansion. Don't you feel rather badly about that?
It was inevitable. Well, we had always expanded, our income had grown, that wasn't going to be the future. We had to move from a position where we had always been a monopoly, we always felt we had to do everything ourselves, and the world had changed outside us. Independent producers were going up, new facility houses were developing. We're sitting now in an independent studio. These were developing. The BBC had to be prepared to say, right, we will now use these resources, we won't do everything ourselves, and that meant inevitably the size of the BBC would be contracted.
You may not worry about it, but some people do. Jocelyn Hay, the voice of the listener and viewer.
Yes, indeed, I do, and I'm very glad you've mentioned policy, because this is of concern. The BBC's role has been central to the quality of British broadcasting, and I think in the future scenario it's probably going to be even more important. Now, it comes off the renewal of its charter in 1996. The Home Secretary has called for a public debate before any far-reaching decisions are made. I would like to know what your vision of the future shape and size of the BBC is at that time, in 5 years' time, because it seems from the outside that many decisions, many priorities are being redefined within the BBC, and decisions are being made now which will preempt much of that debate in future. And they are being made very often, it seems from the outside, for short-term financial reasons rather than from long-term reasons of providing a strong central core of British broadcasting.
Can we answer that? Are irrevocable decisions being made now?
No, what we've done is set up these 15 groups to actually ask the difficult questions. What should the BBC be doing for the future that it's not doing at present. We've talked about a 24-hour rolling news. What it should it not be doing that we are doing at present, and we've talked a bit about popular music and all these kind of issues. Now, the process that we've gone through is set up these groups, and it's been a process of groups of men and women across radio, across television, across the World Service, looking at these issues. We will be, over the next 6 months, considering these as the boards, and then we'll issue, after the election now, a statement of how we see the BBC's future as public service provider.
A lot of these decisions are being made on the assumption that there is going to be less money available. Now, Professor Ehrenberg.
Now, I'm very worried that finding radically more money for the BBC is not on your agenda, on the BBC's agenda. If you ask viewers, which is your market, then if they have the option of watching ITV and Channel 4 free without paying the license fee, they say not on your Nelly. 99% of them say we want to pay for BBC1 rather than give it up. My question, Michael, is do you think that viewers, your market, want you to raise more money from them to make better programs, a wider range of better programs, or at least programs as good as they used to have, or do you want to have do they want to have cuts?
I think that whatever we've done in terms of cuts have not damaged the range and variety of our programming. I'm absolutely sure the changes we've made of cutting resources, getting out of buildings, reducing our internal provision and relying more on the outside market have not affected the amount of money put into programs. In fact, it's enabled to put more into programs. Now, whether the public would be prepared to pay a higher license fee than a consumer index, it will be part of the debate.
Let's just try, shall we? How many people, will you, just a second, sir.
The BBC is paid for by people across the whole of the country. There are as many people living in the North region as live inside the M25. Yet if we look at arts coverage in particular, you'd think it was LWT. Now, what are you going to do to make arts coverage cover the whole of the regions so that England is not a blank space, so that the Burnley National Blues Festival, which is First Division, is not ignored, while its football team, which is Fourth Division going on Third, is covered?
I think that's a genuine criticism that I take very seriously. I happen to come from Birmingham. I'm slightly disappointed that the Late Show, which was a major investment in arts programming, has actually concentrated too much in the southeast of England. I want its remit to be wider. I want the BBC to be representing the regions, the regional arts festivals, the music festivals, more than we have in the past. We've made that very clear to all our staff that we want to do it. The BBC is the British Broadcasting Corporation. Too much money, I believe, is spent in the southeast, and we need to spend more money outside.
Can I take a point from the lady in black up there?
I was involved in the Reptile Protection Trust complaint. If there are a number of letters, and there were over 100, all asking 3 specific points, and those 3 specific points you'd assume would be able to be handled in 3 specific answers, but to those specific points, they weren't. So it was like a standard evasion rather than a standard letter.
A standard evasion.
Well, I'm sorry about that. I mean, I've tried very hard to open the BBC up and make it more accountable. The fact that I'm sitting here, I assure you, nobody else who runs a broadcasting organisation in the world is prepared to do this. They come and look at it and they say, that's a good idea, and they don't do it. So I do believe in an open and accountable broadcasting organisations. We take complaints seriously. We have the listeners and viewers correspondence section, and I'm sorry if you didn't feel we adequately handled it.
Well, I'm afraid that really is all that we have time for tonight. Our thanks to Sir Michael Checkland for occupying the hot seat. Thanks too to our studio audience, who actually do come from all parts of the country and not just from the southeast. I hope you feel that some of your questions have been answered. BiteBack will be with you next Sunday afternoon in its regular monthly slot. We'll be looking at the BBC and advertising, our commercials sneaking in through the back door, and a film report shows how the sound on natural history programmes is anything but natural. If you want to take part in BiteBack, our phone number and address follow shortly. But for now, goodbye. You can write to us at BiteBack, PO Box 2085, London W12 8XR. And please include your phone number. Or you can call us on the hotline on 081 749 9779.
Over the coming week, there's an opportunity to air your views about BBC Radio to the controllers of the individual networks. And your first opportunity to call the controller begins tomorrow evening at 9, as Radio 1's Johnny Beerling will be discussing your views on the network, now in its 25th year.
A major documentary series, new for '92 on BBC1. The definitive television biography of Winston Churchill.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing ground.
Churchill, at his best, in other words, during the war, was a man of towering greatness. But if you go back to pre-war years, he wasn't reliable.
Martin Gilbert's television biography of Churchill starts Wednesday week at 9:30 on BBC1.
In 40 minutes, we embark on a new 4-part series chronicling the history of the Nobel Prize.
I didn't belong to one